At 9:15 on a Friday morning, a mountain of coal waste began to move above a Welsh village. There was no siren. No evacuation. Below it, children had just taken their seats at Pantlas Junior School. Minutes later, the school was buried. 144 people were killed, including 116 children. The collapse looked sudden. The warnings were not. Aberfan sat in the Taff Valley of South Wales, a community built around coal. The Merthyr Vale colliery employed generations of local families. Like every mine, it produced enormous quantities of waste, broken shale, stone, and fine coal that could not be sold. The National Coal Board, or NCB, piled that material on the hills above the village. By 1966, 7 waste tips stood over Aberfan. The newest was tip number 7. Work on it had begun in 1958. It rose on a steep slope directly above homes and 2 schools. More importantly, it was placed over ground where water emerged. That fact was not hidden. Springs appeared on local maps. People who worked on the mountain knew the hillside was wet. The official tribunal would later conclude that the disaster came from a fundamental mistake, tipping on ground whose water conditions made it unstable. Coal waste is not a solid mountain. It is a loose mixture. When water enters its pores, friction can collapse. The material can change from a heap into a dense, fast-moving slurry. Tip 7 was being fed by a conveyor and rail system, while water moved unseen beneath it. There had already been rehearsals. In 1944, a large slide from another Aberfan tip stopped short of the village. In 1963, part of Tip 7 itself moved. The slide damaged infrastructure near the top and showed that the waste could fail. Operations continued. Residents had also complained about water and coal waste coming down the slope. In 1963, Pantlas school officials raised concerns after slurry flooded the school grounds. The problem was treated locally, not as evidence that the mass above the village demanded a full safety review. This was the institutional failure at Aberfan. Information existed in pieces. Quarrymen saw water. Residents saw flooding. Managers knew about earlier slips. Maps showed springs. But no one assembled those facts into the obvious question: should millions of tons of loose waste be stacked above a school on saturated ground? The NCB had no effective national system for inspecting the stability of its tips. Responsibility was scattered. The men depositing waste were not trained as geotechnical engineers. Senior managers assumed local staff would recognize danger. Local staff assumed the accepted method must be safe. Familiarity became permission. October 1966 brought heavy rain. In the days before the disaster, water soaked the waste and the hillside beneath it. On the morning of October 21, workers reached Tip 7 and found the rail track distorted and the tip sinking. They began discussing what to do. No warning reached the village below. At about 9:15, the saturated section broke free. Witnesses described a roaring sound. Hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of waste rushed downhill. The black flow crossed the canal and railway, destroyed farm buildings and houses, and struck Pantlas Junior School. The children had returned from assembly only minutes earlier. The slide smashed through the building and filled classrooms with mud and rubble. Teachers, miners, parents, police officers, firefighters, and volunteers dug with shovels and bare hands. The unstable waste made every movement dangerous. Some children were brought out alive. But as the hours passed, hope narrowed. The final toll was 116 children and 28 adults. Nearly half the pupils at Pantlas Junior School were killed. In a small community, almost every street lost someone. The disaster could not be explained away as an unpredictable act of nature. A tribunal was appointed within days. It heard evidence for 76 days and questioned 136 witnesses. Its report was unusually direct. The tribunal placed responsibility on the National Coal Board. It said the disaster was due to a total absence of a tipping policy and was compounded by failures at many levels. The report rejected the idea that unknown geology made the collapse unforeseeable. The danger of tipping over water was basic, and the springs were known. Yet institutional accountability was thin. No individual was prosecuted. No NCB employee was dismissed or demoted because of the disaster. The chairman, Lord Robbins, initially defended the board before accepting responsibility. For families in Aberfan, official regret arrived after the one decision that mattered could no longer be changed. Then came another fight. The remaining tips still loomed above the village. Residents wanted them removed. The government and the NCB argued over cost. Eventually, £150,000 was taken from the Charitable Disaster Fund to help pay for removal. Money donated to grieving families was used to correct the danger created by a state industry. Decades later, that money was returned, and further compensation followed. Aberfan changed the law. The Mines and Quarries Tips Act of 1969 created stronger controls over waste tips. Inspection, drainage, records, and responsibility became harder to ignore. But those protections were written after a school was buried. The deepest warning at Aberfan was not one dramatic memo. It was a pattern: a wet hillside, mapped springs, earlier slides, flooded school grounds, distorted track, and an organization without a serious system for tip safety. Each sign was treated as someone else's problem. Engineering disasters often begin long before a structure moves. They begin when routine replaces curiosity, when divided responsibility becomes no responsibility, and when the absence of a previous catastrophe is mistaken for proof of safety. Today, a memorial garden stands where Pantglas Junior School once stood. The hillside has changed, but the lesson has not. The collapse lasted minutes. The conditions that made it possible accumulated for years. At Aberfan, the warnings were there.